New York State has more than 19 million people. It also has more than 1 million dead buried in unmarked mass graves on an island 1 mile from the Bronx, and no one is coming back for them. It has a 13-story abandoned psychiatric tower on Long Island where 9,303 people once lived in what was a self-contained city, with its own railroad, its own farms, and its own morgue. It has a 20-acre island in the East River, where 1,021 people died in a single morning, and where one woman was later imprisoned for 26 years without ever being convicted of a crime. It has a subway station sealed since 1945, still intact, still looping silently beneath Manhattan twice per hour. These are 12 of those places. Stay for number 1, because that story involves 20 children and a number that has never been fully reckoned with. If this kind of research is what you came for, this channel goes deeper every week. Today, we are counting down 12 abandoned places in New York that Google Maps won't show you. Underneath City Hall Park in Lower Manhattan, there is a subway station that has not seen a paying passenger since New Year's Eve 1945. The platform is intact. The Guastavino tile vaults are intact. The brass chandeliers and the stained glass skylights are intact. The station, designed by the firm Hines and Lafarge, closed, not because it deteriorated, but because the subway cars got longer, and the platform's curve became too dangerous to board safely. On December 31, 1945, with no announcement and no ceremony, the city sealed the entrances and moved on. The 6 train still loops through it twice per hour. If you stay in your seat past Brooklyn Bridge City Hall on a southbound 6 train, the closed station will appear around the curve, hold for roughly 45 seconds, and disappear. The NYC Transit Museum offers occasional official tours, which sell out within minutes. Most people who pass through it have no idea they were there. In 1964, Governor Nelson Rockefeller commissioned Philip Johnson to build the largest and most spectacular state pavilion at the New York World's Fair, with explicit instructions to make it permanent. Johnson spent an extra $500,000 on the foundations for this purpose. The result was a 226-foot observation tower, a ring of 16 concrete columns supporting the world's largest cable suspension roof at 50,000 square feet, and a floor tiled with 567 terrazzo panels, forming a highway map of New York State. At its peak, around 55,000 visitors came through daily. The roof was removed by 1976 after the panels became dangerous. The towers were closed. The terrazzo map is almost entirely gone. What remains is a roofless concrete ring in Flushing Meadows Corona Park in Queens, listed on the National Register of Historic Places since 2009. Philip Johnson later wrote that the pavilion had become something he loved more as a ruin than as a building, which is one way to handle the situation. Roosevelt Island is a narrow sliver of land in the East River, a few hundred feet off Midtown Manhattan. Most people know it for the tram that crosses from 59th Street. Fewer know about the building at its southern tip, a Gothic revival ruin from 1856 designed by James Renwick Jr., the same architect responsible for St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. The Renwick Smallpox Hospital was built to isolate patients with one of the era's most feared diseases, separated from the city by a few hundred yards of water. Blackwell's Island, as it was then called, served as the city's official holding ground for its most difficult problems: the criminal, the psychiatric patient, the contagious. The outer walls and Gothic window frames still stand, maintained now as a stabilized ruin in South Point Park, accessible for free. Renwick designed the building to look like a small English Gothic cathedral. Pointed arches, carved stone ornament, for patients who were brought there against their will and had no power to leave. The grandeur was for everyone who didn't have to be inside it. Wiley Post left from here in 1933 and became the first person to fly solo around the world. Howard Hughes left from here in 1938 and set the record for the fastest circumnavigation of the globe, landing to a crowd of thousands. Amelia Earhart used these runways. The world's first police aviation unit was established here by the NYPD in 1929. Floyd Bennett Field opened May 23, 1931, as New York City's first municipal airport, built on 387 acres of former marshland on the Brooklyn waterfront, on land that had previously held a fish processing village called Barren Island. It was named for Floyd Bennett, a Brooklyn-born aviator, who co-piloted the first flight over the North Pole in 1926 and died 2 years later, rushing to assist downed European flyers. The Art Deco terminal with its Doric columns was intended to be the gateway to the most important city in the world. LaGuardia opened in 1939. Floyd Bennett lost its commercial purpose almost immediately. The Navy took over in 1941 and ran the field for 30 years, commissioning more than 20,000 aircraft for the war effort. The National Park Service has administered it since 1972. Here's the thing. The sanitation department now uses the runways to train truck drivers in parallel parking. Hangar B still holds more than a dozen vintage aircraft, World War II seaplanes, cargo freighters, biplanes, tended by retired mechanics who come in 3 times a week, just because they cannot stop. 600 soldiers and 37 officers were stationed at the far eastern tip of Long Island in 1942, manning guns capable of firing 23 miles into the Atlantic Ocean. None of those guns was ever fired in combat. Camp Hero was built as a coastal artillery installation to defend New York Harbor from German submarines. The base was deliberately camouflaged as a civilian fishing village. Concrete bunkers painted to resemble Cape Cod houses, fake church steeples erected over ammunition magazines. When the threat shifted to Soviet bombers, the Air Force arrived in 1951 and installed a 126-foot S-Age radar tower in 1958. The tower's antennae emitted signals at up to 425 megahertz, strong enough to interfere with television sets throughout the surrounding area. The base officially closed in 1981. The government removed almost nothing, disclosed almost nothing, and retained ownership of the underground infrastructure. Conspiracy theories filled the silence. The so-called Montauk project alleged that kidnapped children had been subjected to mind control experiments in labs beneath the tower. There is no credible evidence for any of it. What is documented, the Duffer Brothers' original pitch deck for Stranger Things, originally titled Montauk, planned to be set at this location, is now archived at the Montauk Library. A state park keeps the original pitch deck for a show that made approximately $1 billion for a streaming company. The radar tower is still there. The tunnels are still sealed. Nobody is scheduled to explain them. Francis Bannerman VI was born in Dundee, Scotland, raised in Brooklyn, and by the end of the 19th century had become the world's largest dealer in military surplus. When the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, he purchased 90% of all captured Spanish military arms and needed somewhere outside the city to store them. In November 1900, he bought Polipel Island in the Hudson River. Native Americans in the Hudson Valley had historically considered the island to be haunted. Bannerman built his castle there. Anyway, he modeled it on the baronial architecture of his native Scotland, used cannon barrels as posts and surplus bayonets as railings, and had the words Bannerman's Island Arsenal cast directly into the outer wall, visible to every ship and train passing through the Hudson Highlands at all hours. It was the world's most elaborately decorated munitions depot. In August 1920, approximately 200 pounds of shells and powder exploded, sending debris to both shores of the river. Bannerman had been dead for 2 years. A fire in 1969 gutted what remained. In December 2009, roughly 30 to 40% of the castle's front wall collapsed. The Bannerman Castle Trust runs guided boat tours from Beacon, New York, May through October. Recent visitors on official tours have been told that unexploded ordnance continues to be found in the soil and water around the island. The arms dealer's business is still technically active. We are 6 entries into this list. If any of the numbers we have covered so far have caught you off guard, and there have been several, drop a thumbs up below and let us know in the comments which one stopped you. We are about to get into heavier territory. In 1913, the New York Times wrote that Seaview Hospital was the largest and finest hospital ever built for the care and treatment of those who suffer from tuberculosis in any form. That was an accurate description. The 37-building complex on the second highest point on Staten Island cost approximately $4 million to construct, roughly $111 million in today's terms, making it the most expensive municipal health facility in the United States at that time. The ornamental tile work was designed and manufactured in Delft, the Netherlands. The hospital was built because in 1900, an estimated 30,000 New Yorkers had tuberculosis, 2/3 of them from the urban poor. Sunlight, fresh air, and cross-ventilation were the best available treatments. Researchers at the facility contributed to the antibiotic breakthrough that eventually made those treatments unnecessary. In 1952, Time magazine ran photographs of Seaview patients dancing in the hallways when the treatment proved effective. The hospital became medically redundant within a decade. Most of the 37 buildings are now in various stages of ruin. The underground tunnels that connect the campus were apparently never fully mapped. One of them runs directly from the pathology laboratory to the morgue, with no above-ground indicator that it exists. The pavilions were designed for a disease that no longer needs ventilating. That is what success looks like from inside an abandoned building. The world's largest known herd of all-white white-tailed deer lives inside a former nuclear weapons depot in the Finger Lakes region of central New York. These animals are not albinos. They have brown eyes. They carry a recessive gene that produces white coats, and in the wild, that trait is almost always fatal. A white deer is visible to predators from a significant distance and rarely survives long enough to reproduce. They survived here because of the fence. The Seneca Army Depot occupied 10,587 acres between Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake, established in 1941. When the perimeter fence went up, 24 miles of it, several dozen white-tailed deer were enclosed inside. The Army hunted brown deer and left the white ones alone. Over 60 years of isolation, the white herd grew to more than 200 animals. The depot's inner queue area was protected by 3 concentric fences. The middle fence carried 4,800 volts, more than double the voltage of an electric chair. Guards were authorized to shoot to kill. The government has never officially confirmed or denied that nuclear weapons were stored there. Multiple independent investigations concluded the depot held the largest Army nuclear stockpile on the East Coast during the Cold War. Here's the wild part. In 2016, the entire 10,587-acre facility, 500 ammunition bunkers, classified Cold War infrastructure, active white deer herd, sold for $900,000. The deer are still inside the fence. Kings Park Psychiatric Center was, for most of its 111-year history, a functioning city. It had a railroad spur. It had a farm, a cow barn, a piggery, a butcher shop, a bakery, a tailor, a fire station, a power plant, and a morgue. At its peak in 1954, it housed 9,303 patients in a complex of more than 150 buildings across Long Island's North Shore. Former staff described it as, if there was one place in the country not affected by the Great Depression, Kings Park was it. It was established in 1885 as the Kings County Asylum, built on the farm colony model. The belief that mentally ill patients would recover faster in open countryside doing agricultural work than in urban institutions. For its first decades, within the limits of what was then possible, it worked. Then the patient population outgrew every planned capacity, and the treatments changed. By the 1950s, Kings Park was performing electroshock therapy. Patients strapped down, subjected to electrical seizures, sometimes lasting 15 minutes, bones sometimes fractured, and prefrontal lobotomies. Conducted by inserting a metal tool through the eye socket and severing connections in the brain. Thorazine arrived in 1955 and began the long decline. Building 93, the 13-story WPA-funded geriatric infirmary, completed in 1939, called the most famous asylum building on Long Island, emptied from the top floor down. As the upper floors cleared, the basement was used to store abandoned patient beds. Photographers who entered after the 1996 closure found row after row of iron frames in the dark, mattresses still in place, as though the patients had simply stood up and walked away. The hospital closed after 111 years. Approximately 90% of the former campus is now Nisququag River State Park. The asbestos in the remaining buildings has made redevelopment impossible. Building 93 is still standing, 1 mile off the Bronx coastline, on a 131-acre island in Long Island Sound. More than 1 million people are buried. Pine coffins, stacked 3 deep, in plots of 150 adults or 1,000 infants, marked with numbered posts. No individual headstones, no names on the ground. Hart Island has been New York City's Potter's Field, its public cemetery for the unclaimed and the indigent, since the first burial on April 20, 1869. The first person buried was Louisa Van Slyke, 24 years old, born at sea, dead alone in a charity hospital. Since then, the island has also served as a Union Civil War prisoner of war camp, a boys' reformatory, a tuberculosis sanatorium, a Cold War Nike missile installation, and a drug rehabilitation center. The last of those structures was abandoned in 1977. Until 2019, the island was classified as correctional property and administered by the Department of Correction. Families were permitted 1 visit per month to a gazebo near the dock. They could not approach the actual graves. Burials were performed by Rikers Island inmates serving misdemeanor sentences, paid 50 cents per hour. Bobby Driscoll, the child actor who voiced Peter Pan in the 1953 Disney film, died penniless in an abandoned East Village tenement in 1968. He was buried on Hart Island in an unmarked grave. His family did not find out until 19 months later, identified through fingerprints. The city's 2025 development plan for Hart Island includes a visitor center, landscaping, and memorial plaques. It does not include any mechanism to individually mark the more than 1 million people already buried there. They are still stacked 3 deep, 1 mile from the Bronx, still numbered, still not named. You can see North Brother Island from the Bruckner Expressway. You can see it from planes descending into LaGuardia. It is 20 acres of overgrown forest in the middle of the East River, 2 miles from Midtown Manhattan, and you cannot legally set foot on it. It has been closed to the public since 1963. On June 15, 1904, the excursion steamship, P.S. General Slocum caught fire in the East River and ran aground on the island's northern shore. Of the 1,358 passengers, mostly German-American women and children from a Lutheran church on their way to an annual picnic, 1,021 died in the fire or from drowning. It stood as the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in American history until September 11, 2001. Riverside Hospital had operated on the island since 1885, treating patients with communicable diseases. 3 years after the Slocum disaster, Mary Mallon, identified as the first asymptomatic typhoid carrier in the United States, linked to at least 22 cases of typhoid fever across 7 households, was forcibly quarantined on the island. She was released in 1910, returned to working as a cook under a false name, and was permanently re-quarantined in 1915. She lived on the island, largely alone, in a small cottage built specifically for her isolation. She could see the Manhattan skyline from it. She died there in 1938. Here's the detail that stops people cold. Mary Mallon was never convicted of a crime. She was never given a trial. She maintained until her death that she was not responsible for the deaths linked to her. She spent the last 23 years of her life imprisoned on an island 300 yards from the city that put her there. She is buried in a Bronx cemetery. The roads curve through the hills of Rockland County, about 40 miles north of Manhattan. Vintage lampposts line them, original to the campus, still standing. Between them, fieldstone buildings in the neoclassical style stand with windows, dark or broken, moss on the stone, some with trees growing through the roof lines. A golf course sits where patients once harvested crops. Dog walkers move through on a Tuesday afternoon, and at first it resembles a college campus until you notice the buildings are too many and too uniformly placed for that. On the roofline of the administrative building, the name of the first superintendent, still legible. Letchworth Village opened on July 10, 1911, in the hamlet of Fields in Rockland County, built across 2,300 acres as a residential institution for the physically and mentally disabled of all ages. The designers modeled the architecture after Monticello. Patients would work the land, tend animals, make toys to sell at Christmas. Buried power lines, curved streets, no walls, designed so the place would not feel institutional. For its first decade within the limits of what was then possible, it largely worked. Then the patient population outgrew every planned capacity. By 1921, 70 beds were crammed into dormitories meant for far fewer. By the 1950s, more than 4,000 people lived in a facility designed for 3,000. By the late 1960s, that number had passed 5,000. On February 27, 1950, while Letchworth still held a favorable national reputation, the facility's research director invited immunologist Hilary Koprowski to administer an experimental live virus polio vaccine to an 8-year-old patient. Koprowski had previously tested the vaccine on himself. After the child showed no side effects, 19 more children received the dose. Of the 20 recipients, 17 developed antibodies. None of the children or their families are known to have given informed consent. This was the first human trial of a polio vaccine in the United States. Brain specimens were routinely harvested from deceased residents and preserved in formaldehyde jars, put on display in the pathology laboratory. Geraldo Rivera's 1972 Peabody Award-winning exposé brought national attention to conditions here. The facility closed in 1996. Most of the more than 130 original buildings remain, the asbestos in their walls making every redevelopment proposal unworkable. About a mile from the main campus, down a dirt path off Call Hollow Road, there is a small cemetery in the woods. Approximately 900 shallow graves, most unmarked. A stone monument reads, "Those who shall not be forgotten." The polio vaccine, first tested in this ruin, helped establish the proof of concept for campaigns that eventually eradicated polio from the Western Hemisphere. The 8-year-old child's name was never made public. There is no memorial to him or to the other 19 children. The monument says, "Those who shall not be forgotten, the institution is a ruin. The cemetery is in the woods." More than 1 million people are buried on Hart Island, with no plan to individually mark a single one of them. My personal favorite entry on this list is Letchworth Village. It holds the best intentions and the worst outcomes in the same place, and a child whose name we still do not know. If a place here surprised you, or if we missed one that belongs, leave it in the comments. And if this is the kind of research you came for,